Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Franco-German Dialogue, I welcome you wholeheartedly to the third and last panel of our today's series, Research Meets Politics. My name is Sebastian Mack. I'm expert for European financial markets at the Jacques Delors Center at the Hertie School in Berlin. And in the next 60 minutes, we have 60 minutes, we will discuss the fascinating subject of sustainable finance. The role of financial markets for the European Green Deal cannot be overestimated. As you know, in our market economy, it is ultimately financial markets who decide what gets financed and what not. So if we want to profoundly rebuild our economy and reach climate neutrality, then this change will also need to include financial markets. Regarding financial markets, this is something that concerns all actors at the financial market, be it central banks, pension funds, banks, or retail investors like you and me. And the idea of sustainable finance is that all financial actors include criteria, aspects of sustainability in their investment decision. So it will not be me to give you an answer how this can ideally work, but we will now have a discussion with my guests and also with you in the audience. And I'm glad that we have now with us distinguished experts here at our panel, and I welcome our guests now. So now here I have a lot of lovely people on the screen. I hope that everybody can hear and see me. So to start with, Mrs. Dr. Sabine Marderer, you are a member of the executive board at the German Bundesbank, and you are representing the Bundesbank also at the steering committee at the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a network of 89 central banks and supervisors all over the world. Then I would like to welcome Madame Laurence Parisot. You have been for 8 years the face of the French Employee Association MEDEF, and since 2018 you are president of Citigroup France. Citigroup, one of the 30 systemically relevant banks in the world. Enchanté. Then going over to Madame Sima Camorier, you are leading the Better Recovery unit at E3G. E3G is a European think tank dealing with the political economy of climate change. And before joining E3G, you have served in various positions in French administration, financial ministry, and also foreign affairs, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, last but not least, as we say, Monsieur Thierry Philippona, you are a member of French supervisory authorities for financial markets, banks, and insurance firms. In 2011, you founded the NGO Finance Watch in Brussels, and you are still serving Finance Watch as a consultant. So before starting our discussion, I would like to invite the audience to ask questions, unfortunately only in writing. So you can do that. You should see a button below the stream, quite straightforward. Ask a question, there you should see. And ideally you also post to which person you would like this question to be addressed. And I will try do my utmost to insert these questions. Just a technical reminder or issue, if today you might wonder why is everything not working as smoothly as it could. I have to tell you that we had some technical issues, but I'm very glad that it was possible to sort them out. And now all speakers, including me, will talk in English and not in their mother tongue. And I'm happy that we nevertheless have now the possibility to have a proper debate. We agreed beforehand to structure our panel in 3 parts. The first part would be, where do we stand? Second, what could we do and should we do? And third, what do we expect for the future? So I would like to start our debate now with you, Frau Mauderer. Can't see Frau Mauderer yet. Yes, wonderful. So central banks like the German Bundesbank, they are always keen on looking at price stability, but nevertheless you are following very closely risks in the financial system. So my question would be, if you could perhaps at the beginning elucidate us a bit, what are the risks stemming from climate change, and how do these risks influence your work at the central bank?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Sebastian. And I would also love to welcome the audience, and, you know, just right before the start of such a famous soccer game, joining us is already a privilege for me. And I think what we do have in common, I think whether you be part of the speakers or part of the audience, is, you know, we all rely on the German-French relationship. And I think before I go into details, I would love to highlight that it is really crucial for us that we use this deep and reliable relationship also when it comes to climate. I think we have to use this powerhouse to combat climate change jointly. And before I raise, you know, the topics we are dealing with the central bank, let me just give you a little insight of, you know, what in our country is going, or countries are going on. What I think is crucial as of today is I think we are at a turning point. And let me start with Germany. We are at a turning point, and you can probably understand that I follow this closely also, since I'm responsible for price stability and financial stability. I have a close look at the developments here. As Sebastian said, climate risk is a financial risk, and I come later to that, what it especially means. But obviously, in our countries, the society and also the institutions have realized that this is a threat, a real threat. And coming back to Germany, even the higher constitutional court has stated that it's not just enough to have ambitious goals, but that is crucial to pave the way to get there. So to talk about the measures, to become precise, and to not wait till 2030, 40, or whensoever one thinks one could start. And I think this is a crucial turning point. And we see, luckily, that not only the government has, you know, even set more ambitious goal, but also all relevant parties so far have, you know, integrated in their election campaign, federal election campaign, climate change and precise measures, what needs to be done. And maybe one aspect, I myself put sustainable finance in a much broader sense, because for me, the most efficient way of combating climate change is a carbon price, a decent carbon price. And now I would also like to go to have a look at France. I think what France is very ambitious, you know, and as the host of the Paris Agreement, I mean, you have clearly very ambitious goals, and I can, I would rather call France also as one of the first movers when it comes to climate change or climate fight, right? One thing the Germans clearly and the Europeans clearly have to learn from the French experience is that, you know, climate change and all the measures, be it a CO2 price or whatsoever, do have, when it comes to implementation, their limits. And this is social tension. What we learn from Gilets jaunes and from carbon price setting is that we have to take the people on the journey, on the long journey towards, climate neutrality, right? That's very important. Sebastian, I leave it up to you. I could dig into a little bit deeper into, what are the risks we are looking at, or we do that in a second round. That's up to you.
Yeah, perhaps we nevertheless to get everybody on the same page, talking about these risks. It would be great if you could elucidate us a bit what exactly we are talking about, because everybody says there are climate risks, but what does that mean for the financial system? I think you would be the best qualified person in that call to say that.
Yeah, so we, from the central bank area, we distinguish between two major risks. The one is the physical risks. So that means, all those risks that show up if we do have drought, wildfire, floods, and so on. It's very easy to understand that once you have those natural disasters, that there will, this implies a huge amount of cost, right? For example, the wildfire in California in 2019, I think, cost, according to some studies, more than $12 billion US. And that's just one wildfire, right? It was a big one, that's clear, but this is just one out of so many different natural disasters, and that's just the beginning, right? Having said that, for me, the much bigger threat is the second category of risk. That's transitional risk. So what do I mean by transitional risk? The transitional risk is that one we see if, especially governments, act too little or too late. And what we would see then in a couple of years is that even governments realize, oh my God, we really have to hurry up. We really have to stop climate change. And so the only way out then will be to set strict rules, strict regime. And that most probably could lead to the situation that some of the business models, even whole industry, would struggle or even would not be able to survive, right? Because if you have regulation and and your business model doesn't comply with the strict regulation, and there's no time for adjustment, well, this is not only bad for the special industry, but for the whole economy and the society, right? Because this implies a lack of labor force, lack of wealth, a lack of income, social tension, and so on and so on and so on. So transitional risk means that we have to reflect: does our society or government act in time and to allow our society orderly? That's basically it.
Thank you very much. Madame Parisot, we just heard some compliments from Dr. Mauderer regarding France as pioneer in sustainable finance, but she was also very clear that the risks for the financial sector stemming from climate change are massive. So you are leading the French department of one of the biggest banks in the world, and the Citigroup would be heavily affected if all these climate risks materialize in the future. So my question to you would be, how does the Citigroup address these enormous risks? What are the countermeasures that you have already taken?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and thank you to Sciences Po, to the Hertie School and the Jacques Delors Center for organizing this Franco-German dialogue. This is very important. What you are talking about, Sebastian, is just transition. And for all industries, transition has to be deployed. So, of course, we have to be cautious. We have to find the good trade-off between risks and opportunities, but there is a path. If you look at a bank like Citi, I can tell you that, of course, there are some risk, but on a day-to-day basis, if I'm thinking on my day-to-day business, so with a very practical experience, the big topic is that each day I have a client who is asking me, how can I issue a new green bond? How can I transform my equity story in a green equity story? And the big difference today compared to, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago is that it's not greenwashing at all. It is real. It is material. All these tools, like the bonds or the loans, the green loans, or we are even talking of a green IPO now. All these are based on very objective material KPI. KPI that have been measured and that are measured on a regular basis by some expert, not related to the bank, not related to the company, but a third party. And very often we have several third parties. So what I mean is we have now a huge shift in the day-to-day business of banks, especially the banks which are working with big corporates, because environmental, social issues are in the mind of the boards, of the CEOs, of the CFOs. So it's now very practical. This is the point I wanted to focus. And just to give you some figures, if you look at the issuance of sustainable corporate bonds, there is an average growth of 70% those past year of ESG bond issuance, 70% per year of growth. If you look at the ESG, environmental, social, governance, managed assets, now we are on a growth of at least 15% per year. And you have coal commitments coming from all over the. I lost you. Did you see me?
You're still there. You're still with us.
Okay. So I was just saying, and this would be my closing remark for this part, all the actors of finance are really working very hard to engage themselves and their clients in this transition, which is a big effort for some financial persons, individuals. This is for many of them, this is like a new language that they have to learn. And our job as bankers is to help to translate the ESG language in the finance language, and to be sure that there is a good understanding and yes, common understanding of these two languages.
Thierry Philippona, when listening to Madame Parisot, I get the impression that financial sector is already on a good path towards sustainability and towards fighting climate change. Does that mean there's no need for any further, possibly legislative regulation, or what is your view on that?
That's a very good question. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts here on this very important topic. And so it's a great pleasure and honor to be discussing and reflecting together. On your question, I think we have to put things in perspective. Look at where we're coming from. Say 15 years ago, if you had said to a financier, sustainable finance, people would have thought, what are you talking about? Today, all financiers say, we want to do sustainable finance. So that's a big progress. Now, what's behind that narrative? Well, the reality, which is normal, is that you have a significant proportion of financiers who do something that is really impactful. You also have not negligible proportion who are doing something which is less impactful, and perhaps some of them are doing something which is very light, to put it very politely. And you know what? This is normal. This is the real world. This is the real life. So there's no surprise in that. So to answer your question, I think we're just in the middle. We've done, call it half of the way. We've gone from denial to recognition that we should do something. Now we're just in the middle of the journey where we have to make sure that we are really doing what we say we're doing. There's a lot of talking about greenwashing and everything, but let's reflect on what greenwashing can mean. In my view, it can mean two things. It can mean, saying you're doing something when you're not doing it, or doing something that has no impact. The very interesting thing is that regulators, supervisors, and legislators at the moment are working on that greenwashing topic to make sure that financial actors in general, whether corporations or investors or banks, are doing what they're saying they're doing. And typically, as we're in this Franco-German dialogue, the French supervisor or the supervisors, IMF and ACPR, have done a lot of work on making sure that financial actors are doing what they're saying they're doing. But obviously, there is also the other dimension, is what is being done impactful? And there, much more needs to be done. And much more needs to be done for two reasons. First reason is that it's not an easy question. It is not an easy question. Hence the fact that if you take all the work being done by the European Commission and at EU level, that platform of sustainable finance, developing social and then environmental and a social taxonomy, all the work on non-financial reporting standards and related topics. Well, that's a lot of work, I can assure you, being part of that process. And it's not easy. It's not easy technically, it's not easy politically. But there's also another dimension that needs to be addressed. It's the fact that basically financiers, all of them, and it's normal, I mean, there's no surprise in that, are both in the business of developing sustainable finance, as I just said it, but also continue to finance non-sustainable activities, because at the end of the day, they finance the world as it is. And the IPCC is telling us that our world is on a path of global warming comprised between 3.7 and 4.8 degrees at the end of the century, which we all know is not sustainable. So guess what? If you're a very large investor or if you're a very large bank, well, by definition, you finance the world as it is, and the world as it is not sustainable. So it's a complex equation because yes, bankers and investors do finance non-sustainable activities, but it's not a case of, we just have to tell them to stop. It's more complex than that because the whole world economy is on that unsustainable path. So that's really something which is very important. But in my view, if we want sustainable finance to work, we have to address, but perhaps that will be for the second round, and stop me if I'm being too long, we have to address both the question of how we make sustainable finance as effective as possible, and also how we address the question of all the finance, the funding that is going to unsustainable activities. And that relates to what Sabine Mauderer was discussing or referring to when she was speaking about the risks. And obviously there is the transition risk and the physical risk that she described. And of course, I could not agree more. I would like to highlight or point out the fact that I think there is a third risk, which is very often neglected, or most of the time neglected, which I would call disruption risk. And disruption risk is really the fact that when you look at what the IPCC is telling us on all the evils that climate change will bring with it, wars, migrations, floods, droughts, I'll stop here. Of course, the functioning of human societies will be disrupted, and of course the economy will be disrupted. And I could compare disruption risk to what happened in this COVID crisis, certainly a year ago, when you had a health crisis which had an impact on the economy, which had an impact on the financial system. That was disruption. And disruption risk is the biggest of all risks. And by the way, it's very difficult to quantify it, if not impossible, but it's a long discussion, so maybe I'm not starting on this now. So this is really, where we're standing today, and we have to work on both fronts. I'll stop here because I'm conscious of time.
Thank you very much for being conscious. Well, next in the first round would be Sima Kamourie. Building on what we just heard by Thierry Philipponnat, but also the other speakers. Obviously, the risks are enormous. Some things have already started to move into the right direction. The financial sector is trying to adapt, also regulators. But now the question will be beyond the EU that is having some first initiatives. What is your view and assessment when looking at the international politics? Did they recognize the need to act, and where do we stand there? I can't hear you yet, unfortunately. I don't know whether the others can hear you.
No, we can't. Can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Give it another. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you very much to the Hertie School and to my alma mater, Sciences Po, for organizing this panel. And this day, it's a pleasure to be with you and with this distinguished panel. You're asking great questions, Sebastian. I'll try to be brief. The situation is as follows. The European Union, amongst all world jurisdictions, is the jurisdiction that so far, and this will not surprise our panel nor our audience, I suspect, is the jurisdiction that so far has had demonstrated the most ambition in tackling this issue. I think Thierry Philipponnat was just mentioning this, but the European Union has been working on a series of legislations and texts and regulations that seek to really build a complete ecosystem of legislation and regulation to address sustainable finance. We're creating labels to define what's green and what's not with the taxonomy. We're getting into disclosures that are mandatory and also mandatory reporting requirements, whether for financials or corporates. Now, when you look at the rest of the world, which was your question, I'd like to distinguish two things. The first is other individual jurisdictions and countries and what I would say advanced economies or middle-income economies are doing. And then the second aspect of this is what is happening in international fora that coordinate economic policy, typically the G7 and the G20. Now, very briefly on individual jurisdictions, apologies. I would say that beyond the European Union, the progress is much less clear with other advanced economies. So, for example, when you look at the United States, there is very little that has been done in terms of official regulation or legislation. There are a few advanced economies that have been taking steps towards implementing mandatory disclosure requirements per the guidelines that were created by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So I'm thinking here of New Zealand, of the United Kingdom, and Japan. But amongst that group of advanced economies, there is not one single jurisdiction, again, that has demonstrated the level of ambition that the EU has. And maybe just very briefly, I would like to note that actually countries of the so-called global south are often discounted. And in fact, they are sometimes, some of them are quite progressive on this front. And there have been early movers on taxonomies, in countries like Malaysia, other countries of Southeast Asia, but also in Latin America. Now, in terms of what's happening in international fora, such as the G7 and the G20, there has been some progress, but it's quite recent. It's very nascent. And we still need quite a lot of detail. Specifically, I would like to tell you very briefly about the G7 meeting of finance ministers that occurred 2 weeks ago. We had good results, arguably, on the front of financial regulation for sustainable finance. However, these results are really quite new, and we do need more detail. So, for instance, G7 finance ministers agreed that mandatory disclosures from firms and financial institutions were a good idea, and that they supported them. We don't have a sense of the timeline yet in which they would encourage implementation of mandatory disclosures in their own respective jurisdictions. They've also called on the IFRS, whom we know because they're the leading body in establishing accounting standards. They've also called on the IFRS to create sustainability reporting norms. But there is very little detail that is known, for instance, for the moment, as to how the IFRS is going to be working with all other bodies and jurisdictions and standard setters who have already been creating reporting standards over the last few years. So the work is there, but it's very nascent. And most notably, and that will be my closing remark, not a word was said on norms to define what is green and what's not. We can call it a taxonomy or something else, a green dictionary. All I will say is that there was not mention that was made of it, either in the G7 or at the April G20 meeting of finance ministers.
All right. Thank you very much for elucidating us on the international dimension. So as a first part, we now have at least tried to frame a bit where we stand, be it at national level, EU, or even internationally. I would now like to jump into the next part, asking the question, what are the possibilities, what can we do, and what is needed? Perhaps we start our second round with Madame Parisot. Here she is, wonderful. Madame Parisot, your compatriot Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank, was saying at a conference just recently of the Bank for International Settlements, the Green Swan Conference, that we should not wait for the financial sector to deal with the problem of climate change, because if we do, we would end up in a financial crisis that we saw 2007-2008. Well, I found that a tough statement, in particular, as obviously things have started moving. So I would like to give the ball back in your field. And my question would be, what can the financial sector realistically achieve regarding fighting climate change? And what is your wish to politics? Where do you need more guidance, more support, clear dates, or clear figures? What would you like to see from politics?
Okay. First of all, to come back to Christine Lagarde's remark, it depends on which financial sector she was referring to, because you remember maybe that Christine also said some years ago that maybe if we had Lehman sisters rather than Lehman brothers, maybe we would not have had a financial crisis. So it always depends on not only on sectors, but also on who are leading the sectors. I can tell you that the financial sector is moving not only by itself, but because the investors are moving in this direction. For example, the pension funds are asking clearly to the private equity or to the markets to do more to tackle climate change. And that's why, as I said, ESG assets under management are increasing so rapidly. But what we need, what we need to go faster is common standards and data which would be recognized. And I would like to take what Mrs. Sima Camarier said. You said we don't have any definition of what is green or not green, what is fighting climate change and what is not fighting climate change. When we will have this definition, and when we have the data, which will allow us to have the right situation, the right figures, I can tell you everything will go very quickly. But maybe the most important, and I'm coming back to the G7 communique, is accounting. If one day we can match financial accounting and ESG accounting, everything will change and we will succeed. But some companies are already doing very interesting things in that direction. For example, you have more and more companies, especially French companies, who are publishing their results with, for example, they publish their regular EBITDA, but they publish also their carbon-free EBITDA. And more companies will do that. It's interesting not only for the public or the investors, but it's interesting also for inside the company, because once you have some other metrics, it will stimulate, foster the different divisions of the company to change the process and to be able to product, to manufacture products and services which are more and more carbon-free. So I think that data accounting will be the biggest tools that we would need to go faster.
I see. Well, thank you very much. Thierry-Philippe Ponard, perhaps building on what Madame Parisot just said, and we can hear that very often, that so far we are lacking exact data on climate risks. As Madame Parisot said, accounting is missing, and without all these data, we cannot really act, at least not regulatory and legislative. Perhaps this is also the reason why so far we have seen only initiatives fostering transparency on sustainability. What would you say? Is that true? We need to wait for additional and other measures until we know more? Or are there other possibilities?
I think there are two dimensions to your question. One dimension is the sustainability reporting that needs to be done by companies so that financiers understand the sustainability dimension of their business. And that's the work done certainly in the EU by EFRAG and by the European Commission. And by the way, we referred earlier to the IFRS, and there's a big, very important debate there that we should not escape, which is whether we're working on a single materiality logic or double materiality logic. Single materiality, which is the IFRS logic, by the way, is financial materiality. In other words, outside in materiality. In other words, what will be the impact of, if we talk about climate change on the accounts of the companies. Double materiality includes single materiality, but has also the other dimension, which is what's the inside-out impact of companies' activities on the environment and on climate. And we in the EU are working on the double materiality logic. And the recent report by EFRAG was very, very clear on that. And this is fundamental. So I would, to be honest, I'm a bit concerned when I hear the G7 say, okay, IFRS, fine. But I think in the EU, we have something, it's not a question of EU versus the rest of the world and everything. It's a question of logic we want to use. Do we want to use only the financial logic, indispensable? Of course, there's a huge financial dimension, but there's also the environmental dimension. So that's the first thing. And there, more work needs to be done, and we should follow, really, I'm absolutely convinced, the EU logic of working on a double materiality approach of non-financial reporting. And then there is a completely different topic, which is the assessment of climate risk on financial institutions. And the questions there is, and it was obvious in the recent Green Swan conference, where I had the pleasure to intervene as well, that there are really two schools on this. There's the school of a number of supervisors saying, we need to measure, we need to quantify, and then when we've quantified and measured, we'll be able to take action. But at the same time, the same supervisors, very often, and I work with supervisors in my country, France, are saying we have a data gap. We don't have the data to analyze what we need to analyze. And I participated in the calibration of the recent ACPR pilot exercise, climate pilot exercise, which is not a stress test because it doesn't come to the conclusion that there's a capital shortfall of X, Y, Z, for a very simple reason, is that the measure is a very interesting exercise, it's a high quality exercise, but that doesn't have the data to come to a meaningful conclusion. So therefore, it's about understanding or trying to understand better what's going on, but not coming to a conclusion. And my point here is that we really don't have a data gap. We simply don't have the data. And when we have the data, it will be too late when it comes to climate change. Because if we think, as central bankers are telling us, and I completely share their view, that climate change will have an impact on financial stability, well, as climate change is really still ahead of us, well, it's happening now, but the biggest impact is ahead of us, by definition, we don't have the data. And when we have the data, sorry to repeat myself, it will be too late. So in the face of this, what do? Do we say, we're hiring data scientists and everything will go well? Well, we can have the best brains in the world. If we don't have the data, we don't have the data. Or do we use our judgment? Do we use a qualitative approach? That's certainly something that we at Finance Watch have been advocating, and we're doing a lot of work with many legislators around the world, EU, UK, US now, Canada, on this, saying, look at prudential regulation. Put prudential regulation in coherence with itself. Put prudential regulation with the recent IEA, International Energy Agency report saying we must stop all investment in new fossil fuel assets immediately. That's the IEA speaking. So, if you apply that to prudential regulation, if we must stop it, well, if a bank or an investor or an insurance company wants to finance it, well, fine, this is a free economy, so do it, but fund it out of equity. Because if we must stop it, it's because the risk is so high that it might destabilize the system. So therefore, as all financiers know, I used to be a banker, I was a banker for 20 years. Any banker knows that when he or she does a very risky activity, that activity should be funded out of equity. So if you use that very qualitative, simple approach of financial regulation, you can actually act today, and we need to act today without waiting for the result of a quantification that will not be meaningful in the foreseeable future. So this is really important, and let's bear in mind that the carbon budget of the planet is comprised between 10 and 15 years. 10 to 15 years from now, it will be too late. So anything that tells us that, perhaps 5 or 10 years down the road, we'll start being able to measure and then we'll see what we do is really not fit for purpose, I think. So replace measurement and quantification, keep doing it, but also use your judgment to reform prudential regulation, taking prudential regulation for what it is, i.e. a risk-based tool. This prudential regulation is about managing risk, and it should be used as such.
Right, I see. Well, I think this leads us very logically to Frau Dr. Mauderer. The German Bundesbank is not only active in monetary policy, but of course also a prudential supervisor. If I have seen correctly, 2 years ago, you did a survey among smaller and medium-sized banks, and the result was, spoiler, 2 years ago, that only 2/3 of the banks included back then climate risks in their risk management. Where do we stand today on the 15th June of 2021, and what would you answer to Thierry Philippon on the need to act?
Well, thank you. Before answering your question, and the results were even worse than you mentioned them, let me just state on what was said before, that that the European Union has the greatest ambition globally. Now, for me, it's not crucial to have an ambition, but for me, is crucial was the outcome and where do we stand when it comes to results. I just want in this circle also warn that we lay back and calm down because we think we are globally the leader. There's a little bit of our own perception that we are the green leaders. We are not, right? We are definitely not. We talk a lot, we have a high ambition, but now it's also to deliver. And what I clearly see is, first of all, it's true, the Commission has really hurried up. If you see when they started and where they are now, this is really something which is phenomenal. But they should not lead us to think, okay, we will be the standard setter. Because what I see so far in the US is, you're absolutely right in saying, well, I haven't seen much of a regulation, but we have to take into account that the Biden administration only took over end of January, and now we have June. So this cannot be in a different way. What I clearly see is also a very high ambition. The same goes is true for China. Of course, they are bipolar, right? They have coal mines on the one hand and expanding there. And on the other hand, I see a massive push towards a sustainable economy as well. So I think for us in Europe, and therefore meetings like those of today are so crucial, our goal and our interest should be to become and to be a global leader, a global standard setter. So, and to be that, to become that, we even have to hurry up a little bit more, right? Especially when we're talking about taxonomy, disclosure regime, CO2 taxes, border taxes, and so on. Okay, now what can we, what needs to be done? And Thierry was absolutely right in, it's not about, being green as of today. It is about enabling the whole industry, all industries, to become medium-term sustainable. It's not about strengthening the already green industries or companies. This would not make any sense, because what we have to do is we have to transform the whole society, the whole economy, all industry, the whole real economy, including the financial services. So it is about transition. It's about allowing companies to go that way. Having said that, how are we going to get there, and what is the role of the financial industry? I think the major threat is we have to make carbon incentive activities unattractive. There are different ways. So carbon pricing is definitely one way. But what is also crucial from a regulatory perspective is that investors and financial institutions, financial markets have to know, what is actually the carbon footprint of the investment I'm intending to do or I have already done, right? This is crucial. So far, investors are lacking data information. And I fully agree with Thierry that, of course, we do not have the full pictures. We do not have complete data set. That's true. But as he said, we cannot wait till we have, 150% sure picture. We most probably won't have that ever because of all those uncertainties we are facing. So fully in line with Thierry saying, well, we have to accept a certain uncertainty. Let me put it that way. So I think it is crucial, and then I would love to sum up in interest of time. It has to be clear who, what is where does each company, each industry stand? They have to communicate this to the financial market, and the financial market will decide where the money goes to. So you always say, well, money makes the world go around. I think money can even change the world, and it's also up to us to, to steer the money into the right direction. Thank you.
Well noted. Uri, you already mentioned the recent meeting of the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors in London, and the agreement to have mandatory disclosure of climate risks. And we heard just now that obviously transparency would not do the job. We need further improvements and stricter measures. Looking at all these international fora, how do you see the chances that we will see soon more?
It's an excellent question. I think I actually would like to just very briefly come back to what Frau Marderer was just discussing. I completely agree with her assessment. I was talking about the EU's ambition and not about its actual realizations. I think it's a very delicate and fraught conversation, politically speaking, in terms of taking that conversation into international fora at the moment. And again, Frau Marderer was discussing the US and China. Let me very briefly come back to these two actors and talk about what is happening in some of these international fora right now. And as with many other topics, we find ourselves with the usual triangle of the US, China, and the European Union. What we are seeing right now is an increasing movement, perhaps, towards having a conversation about international harmonization of norms on sustainable finance in the G20. Specifically in the G20, there is a working group on sustainable finance that was established by the Italian presidency, and that is currently co-chaired by the United States and China. Now, you may recall that back in March, when John Kerry did his European tour of capitals, Brussels and Rome and Paris, amongst others, he heavily pushed back, in particular in Paris, on Bruno Le Maire, when Bruno Le Maire mentioned the fact that the US, for instance, should adopt a taxonomy that is identical to the European taxonomy. John Kerry at that moment also added the fact that, typically speaking, the US does not believe, quote unquote, in excessive regulation. So that did not bode well at the time for the US's ambitions on the taxonomy front. Fast forward to April and the Biden summit, and again, Frau Marderer was absolutely right in pointing out the fact that things are moving very fast, as usual, on the American front. Janet Yellen gave a speech at the Institute of International Finance where she did acknowledge that a conversation on taxonomy, she did not call it like that, but it was code word for taxonomy, that a conversation on taxonomies and their international harmonizations should occur at the G20, specifically in that sustainable finance study group that the US co-chairs with China. Now, it so happens that China is one of the world's first movers in taxonomies. They have a catalog that is effectively a taxonomy. They worked on that very early on because they're the world's largest emitter of green bonds. And China has also very interestingly worked with the European Union very closely on finding common grounds for an internationally harmonized taxonomy. And that was not in the G20. That was in another body called the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. And the United States, to this day, is not a member of this body. And so there is a little bit of a dance going on at the moment, at least on the matter of taxonomies and establishing an internationally harmonized framework for taxonomies globally. And that dance is between the EU and China on the one hand, in the context of the IPSF, and the US and China on the other hand, in the context of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. So I would say, watch that space, watch what happens at the next G20 Finance Ministers meeting in July. I would only add one last point on the double materiality issue that Thierry Philippon mentioned. He's absolutely right that the G7 finance ministers, when mandating the IFRS, in a sense, were taking a stance that was pro-single materiality. However, if you do look at the communiqué, they recognized straight after that double materiality is a discussion and a debate. And so they leave the door open as to how we should integrate that. So these are some of the two major questions I would be looking at in the international space. Number one is internationalization of taxonomies and finding common grounds. And how is China going to position itself between the EU and the US? And number two, the extent to which the IFRS Foundation is going to listen to the noise that a lot of standard setters, in particular EFRAG at the EU, are making with regards to double materiality and the extent to which they are going to integrate that in their work moving forward.
Thank you very much. My last question would go to Madame Parisot again, because you are, as president of French business part of an American bank, you are, let's say, sitting at the link between Europe and the rest of the world. So we heard that from Dr. Mauderer that unfortunately Europe is no longer leading the path towards sustainable finance. What is your impression? Is there still a Brussels effect to be seen, meaning that as we had before with environmental policy, Brussels, Europe moves first and others follow? Or do you agree with others we have already lost track and that it will be possibly the US under President Joe Biden to be the first mover?
I have mixed feelings about that. First of all, and still on a very practical experience, I would say that until now, in the business world, the European, and sorry, but I have to say the French, are very ahead on this issue. And if you talk with board members of European corporate and board members of American corporate, there is a gap, and all the French and the European are much more focused on ESG issues than the American one. That's for the corporates. On a more broadly perspective, I was very surprised and it was a deception for me to see in the G7 communiqué that, of course, and this is a good news, they ask for mandatory report, but the reference in the G7 communiqué was the TCFD. And there was no reference to the European taxonomy. So I hope that in the months to come, and especially between now and the Glasgow summit, the Franco-German coalition and the European will push the European taxonomy. There is no reason that the US approach will dominate. We have to defend our European approach. I think so very strongly.
Thank you very much for these final words. Well, looking at the clock, I see that we have already reached our time limit. So let me perhaps briefly wrap up. In the last 60 minutes, we discussed the challenges for the financial industry, but also for politics stemming from climate change. We clarified that the risks are enormous, not only for our planet, but also for the future of the financial industry itself. We have learned that change is possible, but only if everybody is doing his or her job, meaning on the one hand, the financial industry, avoiding also greenwashing and other issues. And on the other hand, we need politics having clear data and path, be it a CO2 price or whatsoever. So what is left to be discussed in the open is where this will lead to. Clear is that we should remain and keep our dialogue alive, no matter of the different interests of the different actors, and no matter how today's soccer game between France and Germany will end. So I thank very much my guests for your thoughtful contributions, and also to the audience for your interest. If you like this discussion, so please let family and friends you follow on social media know. And I hope to welcome you again for the next occasion. Vielen Dank und au revoir.
Merci.
Vielen Dank. Au revoir.
Digitalisierung,
la protection environnementale,
Europas Zukunft,
Migration,
la souveraineté européenne.
Wirtschaft.
Nous sommes d'accord, l'Europe est face à de nombreux défis. Pour obtenir des résultats, il est essentiel de communiquer ouvertement et d'être à l'écoute. Pour cela, nous avons créé une plateforme, le Dialogue franco-allemand.
Diese Gesprächsreihe flankiert die Vorhaben des Vertrags von Aachen und soll den Zusammenhalt stärken. Das ist uns wichtig, denn wir an der Hertie School setzen uns ein für Multilateralismus und Kooperation.
Ce qui fait la force et la spécificité de la relation franco-allemande, c'est le fait qu'elle repose sur un dialogue quotidien qui porte sur tous les sujets.
Der souveräne Nationalstaat darf nicht verschwinden, aber wir dürfen Europa auch nicht verschwinden lassen. Gemeinsam müssen wir die Probleme lösen, nicht durch eine Abschottung von Europa und von der offenen Gesellschaft.
Die deutsch-französischen Zukunftsgespräche sind eine Eventreihe mit 3 Formaten. Beim Sicherheitsforum geht es um Kooperation in der Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik. Bei Wissenschaft trifft Politik schaffen wir Synergien und verknüpfen Wissen. Und die zweitägige Pariser Platzkonferenz bietet den Rahmen für intensiven inhaltlichen Austausch. Auch mit Ihnen. Wir freuen uns, wenn Sie dabei sind.